All right. So our next speaker is Dr. Logan Ausman, and he is going to be speaking about a framework for OT&E of rapidly changing software systems, specifically C3I and business systems. So let me pull this up for you. There you go.
Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about a topic that kind of came about a couple of years ago. Allie Goodman and I developed some ideas about testing command, control, communications, and intelligence, and also business systems based on our experiences working in support of DOT&E in OT&E of those systems. So to start, first of all, I think everybody here probably is aware of this, but software is widespread in DoD acquisitions, and we can make that claim not just based on intuition, but if you look at, say, the DOT&E annual report for last year, 82 of 87 systems in the annual report mention software, cyber, which I'm using as a proxy because if you're doing cyber testing, you probably have software, or both in that. And this is just kind of a smattering of images of those different types of systems. And they range from planes to torpedoes to ships to tracked vehicles to laptops out in expeditionary environments and to command centers in fixed sites across the globe. So to scope this talk, it's going to be on these C3I and business systems, what you could kind of lump together as information systems. And the commonality of these types of systems that differentiates them from, say, a tank or a ship or something else with software is that these are primarily software. So what do we need to think about when we think about the performance of these systems? If we're going to evaluate the performance, what are the things we have to consider? Well, because they're primarily software, it's very easy for people to think, well, we'll start with software functionality and maybe the hardware platform or infrastructure that it's on. And that's a pretty common starting point for testing, and often is a large component of the testing you see of these systems. But it's not just that simple. You have external systems that these operate with. You have system users and support that interact with that system. And then at the very end here, you have what we'd say are decision makers, but basically information consumers or customers of the information that these are producing. And it's kind of the interactions of all of these different pieces that kind of manifest your performance of your system. So when you go to do an operational test and evaluation of these, you really have to consider the holistic performance of the system when you are going to design an operational test. Now, before we kind of get into that piece, how is the testing going to fit for software? Because I think that's kind of one of the big questions currently within, I think, DoD and perhaps other areas of government is how do these fit? So first let's look at the life cycle of DoD acquisition programs. Now, I think this is something almost everybody here is familiar with. Show of hands, how many people have dealt with programs testing of a program that follows something that looks like this? Okay, this is a major capability acquisition program, and it's very much a kind of a sequential in-series way of doing things. You start with some idea of we need a capability, and then you kind of look for maybe some possible candidates. Okay, now we kind of start developing some candidates. When we find one we kind of like, we say, okay, well, let's get it ready to go out the door. And as it gets ready to go out the door, we now start building some so that we can test it. And then we finally test it. We say, okay, it's ready to go. It goes out into the field. Maybe there are a few loose ends, and you have to do an additional OT just to tie up those loose ends. And then testing's done, and you're in this operations and sustainment piece. And this is kind of what you see for things that look like that. And also historically was kind of how software was tested. But, you know, software development, at least as conceived right now, really doesn't follow that kind of paradigm. You know, you can, yes, this kind of looks like it's in series, but it's really not. It's iterative. It can be done in parallel. And also the characteristics of it are the requirements may be vague or they may change. The timelines are much shorter. And as a result, you kind of have this idea, at least this is kind of how DoD has, you know, with the software acquisition pathway, said this is the way we see software acquisition happening. And so what does that mean for OT&E? Well, it means OT&E has to be matching that paradigm. It has to be continuous. It has to be adaptable, flexible. And also, it's never complete. Thanks. But I also think that this is a bit simplified. So you've got this kind of tiny area here where you have this thing that says planning phase, and then you have this kind of area here where everything's going rapid and fast and rapidly changing all the time. And but if you look at what is maybe a very simplistic view of the maturity of a software-intensive program, it doesn't quite look like that. You have kind of this idea of planning, but then before you get to this kind of rapid iterative change and constant updates, use in the field, all going on at the same time, you kind of have to get to this stuff is usable. And not just usable as in the functionality works, but going back to that complexity of this is used by people and organizations and interacts with other systems. That all is part of that maturity, that performance maturity.
But do you see that being spread out across all the spins, or is that one of the spins? Right? You see what I'm saying? Is that in a
Well,
spin?
it could be within a spin. I'm thinking of this maybe at a higher level. So if you say the spins, I'm really thinking of where you see this thing that says steady state. That is where I think of those spins. Okay, I've built something that is useful, that's stable, and now I'm kind of, as it's out and it's in use, I'm constantly either upgrading, modifying, but the changes are relatively small compared to the overall baseline, right? Like Microsoft products, like say Microsoft Word. The first edition of that was probably a very big build to get it out the door. But once it's out the door, yeah, it gets changed on the fly often, but the tweaks are minor compared to the overall build, right? So, and for purposes of OT&E, we kind of, at least without any additional information, have to kind of start with this assumption of to know in this steady state whether or not my system works, I need some sort of base of knowledge to be able to say, well, it worked in the first place, right? It really made it into that area where it's ready to use. So now there are a couple of ways this could go. Like I said, that first case is where it's completely brand new, or maybe I've got a program adopting something where they say, hey, this is in use now, but there's no test data on it, or the use case they're bringing it from was different than the one they're going to employ it with now, and so therefore the information you have might not quite translate. But then there's also the case where maybe they are actually adopting something where, hey, this already has some data on it and we can make use of that. So, but in either case, as testers, we have to be adaptable to be able to fit anywhere in this kind of continuum of the development maturity level. So, and the reason for that is, what I'm going to talk about after this is kind of the challenges that we have, and this is to kind of illustrate what challenges we're going to face and what we kind of need to solve. So when you get to the, say, testing of this, what do you have as the maturity kind of increases? Well, as you get something, maybe some level where a user is ready to touch it, you can start looking at some functionality. You might be able to get to look at some basic single user interaction with your system. And then as it gets a little bit more mature, now we can start looking at organizations or collections of users using this, because it's not just I've got one user using a system and it's their interaction with the functionality. They have a job to do that fits within a team, and that team together usually has to do some sort of work to make the mission successful. So it's not just, oh, it works for that single user, but it works for all the users, the different types of users that use that system. And then eventually you get to not just a single unit of users, but units of users, especially if you're talking about globally distributed systems where maybe I have a database and I have multiple organizations all interacting with that database and interacting with each other. And so, in order to be able to support that, the readiness of OT&E needs to actually precede that of this system. It's not enough for me to say, oh, you guys are ready to test. Okay, well, now we'll get ready. You've got to be there ready to test when the system maturity makes it ready to be tested. That means your tools, environments, et cetera, need to be ready. So what does this mean? Well, during planning, you kind of need to have a strategy for getting operational T&E in place before you get to ramp up. You have to know, what do we need to do to be ready? Then kind of during ramp up is when you really establish this workforce and infrastructure for testing. And you get the tools and other things that you identified in that strategy in place and up and operational. And then at the end of ramp up is when you would probably do a kind of a first evaluation to say, hey, is this actually ready to be used? And then during steady state, you're maintaining that infrastructure, that workforce, that test capability along with that of the system. And so what is the key takeaway of all this? For OT&E to remain responsive to these anticipated this anticipated development cadence, we need these representative testing environments in place, ready to go before the system is ready. And what will that enable you to do? Get data at different places along that continuum of development. I've got data going at the earliest stages that I can get useful data all the way up through till, hey, we're mature, this is ready to go, and we're getting pieces of data that go along with that maturity of the system. So early on, you might be getting some functionality, some basic human system interaction, and then as it matures, you're going to get more operationally representative use in your evaluation so that you can do a full-on OT&E without having to stop everything, so you can do one big block event all at the end. So the two challenges in order to make this happen, at least as we see them, are infrastructure. You've got to acquire, develop, and accredit the infrastructure and tools for this OT&E to happen. And then the workforce. You have to actually embed your workforce into the program activities. You can't just come in at the end of everything and say, okay, what do you want us to do? What are you building? What are you getting? You've got to be there with them so that as this thing is changing, because it's rapidly changing, we are there and have seen that as it's going on and understand what testing we need to do to support the decisions to use these systems. So what does it mean to acquire, develop, and accredit this? What does that piece consist of? Well, identifying the data needs and collection methods, as a start. Do we have what are we trying to measure? What measures will tell us whether the system is good or not? What data do we need in order to address those measures? Are there any environments that are currently available that will do the job we need it to? We're going to take a look at them, evaluate them. If they don't exist, how hard is it going to be to get one? Well, if they don't exist, we have to develop and acquire them. And then at the very end, you have to verify, evaluate, and accredit these environments and tools as suitable for the purpose you're going to apply it to. And that doesn't mean, oh, this worked for case A, so I'm going to apply it to case B when case B is totally different from A. You have to make sure that it actually meets the validation, verification, and accreditation is actually for the application you are going to use these tools for. So, and then when it comes to embedding operational testers, well, this is a little bit more involved. So when you're talking about planning, what does that mean? Well, get involved right away. Participate in requirements discussions so you can understand both the individual's user's needs up through that of actually the force and the joint force and the DoD itself. Being able to understand that holistic piece and also talking through the requirements with the users so that you can come at something that the users and the testers and hopefully also the developers all understand what the actual need is. Because sometimes it's a matter of, everybody's seen that diagram of what did the requirements people say, what did the developers develop, what did the testers test, what did the users get in the end, and it's all different. And a lot of that has to do with talking to each other so you can come up with what is it you actually need? Because maybe the words and language you are using are not the same as I understand them. Then participating in meetings to actually understand, well, what is your strategy for acquiring this? What is your strategy for developing? How frequently do you want to update? How big are those updates? When are you going to do the planning? And then once we understand those, developing some high-level, like kind of large, almost menu of measures and metrics you will need so you can choose the correct test environments and test tools. And then also participating in that accrediting of the environments to obtain the data you need for the evaluation. And then once that's done, now we talk about embedding into the process when you start looking at this is maybe more for those cyclic pieces of the iteration, but also could be done during ramp up. And that is, I'm going to look at the releases to scope my testing. I'm going to track the features to understand these user needs and requirements, especially during these rapid changes. And then also looking at the user stories because, one, those can highlight opportunities to collect operational data, but then also looking at the three of these together to kind of understand how they all connect from bottom to top. And then once I've done that, that's kind of the planning. Now it comes kind of the execution. I'm going to monitor automated, manual, and I'm also going to look at the deployment of software in order to get data to build this kind of body of evidence to do this kind of ongoing evaluation over time. And because software is never done, I'm not just going to look at a development of a release. I'm actually going to look at the interaction of my pipeline with operations, because that kind of pipeline itself is almost a sustainment piece of the operations of my system. So I'm going to look at that to, one, understand how it affects the operations, but also I can use the effects of the software once it gets out into the field to kind of understand, is my testing picking up the things it needs to pick up? are my measures measuring the right things? Are they predictive of the performance out there, or is there something I need to consider in my testing so I can revise my testing processes? And of course, because cyber is important, cyber should be, checked throughout. But I think that kind of goes for even more. A lot of this stuff should just be kind of checked throughout. So tying this all together, this is kind of what this all looks like kind of put together. You have the early and continuous involvement as we look at this life cycle of the maturity of the program. You have a OT&E-like thing at almost the end of ramp up, but it's not like I wait until that very end to do an event. I'm getting the data as soon as I can. It's that evaluation and reporting that happens to inform the user base, whoever's accepting the system, that yes, your system is now at that level of maturity where you can use it out in the field, and it's from this point on what we would consider a steady state. And from that point on, you can now do what you would call risk-informed OT&E to determine whether or not you're maintaining that maturity, maintaining that acceptable performance as the program continues. And so, and I think that that's really kind of the key to all this working. Now, so what do? Ramp up, get data when it first is ready to be exposed for operations. Conduct OT&E to inform the decision to deploy the first product. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what this risk-informed OT&E means next. But before I do that, I'm just going to note that this is, as I said, a very simplified picture of software maturity. In reality, it could go back to ramp up depending on the size of the change you want to make, whether or not you're going to reconfigure, if you're going to reconfigure or refactor or refurbish some sort of piece of software in a large way, maybe redo the architecture, you're going to have to consider, well, am I really back in ramp up? Or again, maybe the program pulls in an existing capability and that ramp up period almost doesn't exist because it's something that's already well known, you've got information for, and you're ready to go. All right, so there are a couple of ways. Now let's say you're in that kind of steady state. How do you scope your testing? Because I think this is what I see as a big challenge for our test agencies out there, and that is, how do we prioritize the testing we're doing given the resources we have? And the answer is there are probably many ways this could be done, and it's going to depend on the situation. So here are just a couple. Let's say the risk that you see from these new developments really is, the risk is really at each release level. Now maybe you're talking about scoping, having very narrow but focused scope tests for each individual release, and I'm going to be really just marching right along with that kind of circle of development that that program is using to acquire this software. In which case I'm doing, I'm right when they say, hey, this is what we need, this is what we're developing for the next release, we're saying, okay, this is what we need to test, we're getting our data, we're doing a kind of an operational assessment kind of at the very end, reporting, and we're kind of jumping right along with them. Now, maybe this is a program where these releases are really just kind of patches, small upgrades, not very, your risk really isn't from these small individual releases. It's really the cumulative accumulation of new capability that drives the risk that we really need to look at the performance of the system, in which case maybe you say, okay, we're going to try and pick periodic points in time to do an evaluation. Now, that might not mean I'm just using those windows to get data. I might be getting data the whole time, but it's simply, when is it I'm going to report on my findings? Or when is it that I'm going to, when I accumulate this data, how am I all going, when am I going to spin it and say, okay, we're going to make a determination of this is how the performance looks over this period. So, and you might do it in that way, where you say, okay, we're going to make sure that we've got a holistic look at this system here. And kind of to summarize, acquiring and developing and accrediting the test infrastructure and tools for OT&E and embedding the workforce into program activities enables OT&E to be responsive and relevant in the informing of decisions to field the software capability as it matures. Those things all together allow you to do an end-to-end system evaluation that includes all of the different factors that influence the performance of the software. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Greg Tazak from DOT&E, work in the Naval Warfare Deputate as an action officer. I'm here listening to this, and it's relatively not necessarily a new topic, but not my forte. So forgive me for my ignorance. In my question, earlier we heard the new director make contrasting how DoD development of software, he contrasted that to Apple, where a product is constantly being ready to deploy. And in an earlier brief this morning, we were talking about how there are sometimes in the joint environment a software update to one system where it impacts or could impact others. So with that in mind, I'm looking at your concept of ramp up to steady state and trying to understand in my mind, how do I as an action officer look at applying OT to a constantly evolving software version? Could you expound a little on that, please?
Sure. So, yeah. So, when we talk about, say, a constantly changing, I think that getting to that, essentially that steady state where we're talking about scoping the test, and I know that there at least for business and information systems, there is DOT&E guidance out on that. That is, and I believe there are maybe attempts to update the process, but the idea being that we look at how big is the change in this update compared to, say, the version that is currently operationally in use and fielded. And the idea being we're going to do an assessment of how big are the changes, what are the risks to the operations based on the size of that change, whether or not the concept of use or the tactics, techniques, or training needs to change, all that kind of considered as a whole, what type of testing will enable us to get the answers we need to say, yes, this system is performing well. And it might be these changes are minor changes in front-end pieces that don't really affect the overall mission much. In which case you can say, yeah, you can kind of catch that, we're changing the background from red to green. Okay, that's all they're doing in the next release. We don't need to run a huge OT to do an evaluation of that. We can let DT inform that operational evaluation with their data. Or maybe I've got an environment that has a digital representation that has a high enough fidelity that we can do our testing and gather our data there, so we don't need to go out and run it on the ship or something like that. But yes, it is a big challenge because the reality is that depiction of the software being rapidly updated and dropping in and out is a very simplified version of the distribution of all the different ways it can occur. And also, Apple is a company that produces software for people to buy. So getting stuff out the door and updating rapidly is what means you get money in, and that's your business model. I would say as DoD, we're buying tools to facilitate a mission. We're not buying tools for the sake of buying software. So I think keeping that in mind too. Thank you, Logan. All right. Okay. Yeah.